First of all, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in the Oral Narratives of Latinos in Ohio project here at The Ohio State University. Today is Wednesday, August 22nd, 2018. Can we start with your full name, please?
Yes, my name is Tracy Lynch Nahera.
Okay. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in San Antonio, Texas, and I lived there for the first about 5.5 years of life, and then I moved up to Tip City, Ohio.
Okay. And tell me about your childhood. What was your daily life like there in this part of Ohio?
Right. Well, my life was a significant contrast in Ohio than what it was in San Antonio. So in San Antonio, if you can imagine, I grew up around family. So my mother is the youngest of 5 children. And I think they all lived in the same little neighborhood in the west side of San Antonio. And so I grew up with, grandparents and with cousins and aunts and uncles. And then when we moved to Tip City, Ohio, we moved there because my dad had a job transfer. He was worked for the Air Force. So we went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We moved to a small rural town outside of Dayton. No Latinos, no family. And it was small. It was significantly different. But, at the same time, there were other things that were really positive about it. And that, all of a sudden I was in a small town that I could ride my bike in from one end to the other. It kind of forces you out of your shell of just being surrounded by family all the time and having to reach outside of those, boundaries and, make friends with other families. So it was very different, very different. So in San Antonio, I would spend, my days I went to a Catholic kindergartens or Catholic school for kindergarten. My sister wore a uniform to school. When we're in Ohio, the small town, we had a public school. No uniforms, no, it wasn't, the Catholic education. It was just so different. And also not having people around you that looked like you, or having the, sounds, of Spanish, or, the smells of the food, that you've grown up with and used to. It was almost an adventure in so many ways. I thought that Texas was like its own planet for some, you could drive all day and still be in the same state. And I remember when we left Texas and I was like, oh, there's something beyond this.
Different.
Right, and driving through the, past the state line, and then reaching Ohio, I want to say the next day, it truly was, just being in an alien world, I think. But at the same time, there's, I think that having those experiences, especially, and it was very shocking for me, having those experiences, kind of made us very curious about the world, and also, I think also acknowledging how special it was being in San Antonio, with family.
Right. So you mentioned you had a sister. Do you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, so I have a younger brother who's 18 months younger, and my sister who's about 18 months older. Okay. Yeah, so I'm the middle child.
You're the middle, okay.
Yep.
What was your relationship like with your siblings? At any point, did you have to take care of them, or what kind of memories do you have of growing up with your siblings?
Yeah, well, my brother and sister and I were all very close. I mean, beyond being close in age, I think, like any typical group of siblings, you form alliances and, pick on one of the other siblings about something. But I think that we all took care of each other. Us three were kind of thrusted into this world that was very different, than what we were used to at an early age. And I think trying to navigate that was very different for each of us. We all have very different personalities. I would say my brother and I are very outgoing, him more so than me. My sister's more of an introvert. So I think we experienced, this transition very differently. But at the same time, I think that we try to help each other, just in reflection, we probably should have helped each other more, but, I think that's how siblings are. But I mean, I think today we probably have a much closer relationship than we did when we were younger.
Great.
Yeah.
You mentioned being able to, one of the things that you remember is being able to ride your bike across the neighborhood. What other activities do you remember doing with your siblings? Probably the snow was new for you.
Oh my gosh, so new. So I remember having to buy like a winter coat. Not sure in Texas you would get a winter coat, but it's not like you ever used it. But having to get a coat and gloves and a hat and seeing snow for the first time, it was just amazing. It was magical. And then that, the novelty of it ended pretty quickly when you started getting numb. But yes, I remember all those things for the first time and how exciting it was. We also were on a swim team, so we had a neighborhood pool in town that we could all ride our bikes to, which of course is probably not something we would have been able to do, living where we were, just riding our bikes, in San Antonio, that was not going to happen. So yeah, getting up in the morning, riding our bikes to the swimming pool for swim practice, riding our bikes home, walking to school every day, walking home. There wasn't any bus service. I think those things where, you hear about small towns like in the 1950s and 60s where people would leave their doors unlocked, right? And kids would just run around all over the neighborhood and wouldn't get home until the sun went down because that's when you knew you had to get home for dinner. That's what it was like. It was so, I think about it now and where we live, and I just live, in northwest Columbus, in a small community. And it's very similar, but there's not too many, I feel like there's not too many communities like that left. And I'm really thankful we have that opportunity to do that.
Yeah. You said you moved to Ohio, your family moved to Ohio because of your dad's job transfer. What else did your parents do, or your mom, what did she do?
Right, so I think that the transfer to Ohio was just incredibly traumatic for our family. So my mom had never lived outside of San Antonio. And when they moved up here, my dad was working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and my mom had worked for the U.S. Postal Service, and since she graduated from high school. Her dad had worked for the post office, and she had shared with me one time, she wanted to go to school, to get her higher education. And her dad at one point said, "No, go to work for the federal government. You're going to make more than the professors." And, which was kind of true at the time. So she was like, okay, I'll do that. And she had worked for the post office for, I want to say about maybe 10 years before they moved up to Ohio. And I think it was really difficult for her, adjusting, to everything. She faced a lot of, I think, bigotry and racism in the town that we settled in, especially, well, I would say especially in the first several years, but really it lasted, I think, throughout the time that they lived there. And it was difficult, I think, for her to, to get employment with the post office or the type of employment that she was ready for. But I mean, my mom's a strong woman. She's super resilient, and she just persevered. And, I think about it, and I don't know if I would have been able to be as strong as she was in that situation. But during I want to say my sophomore year in high school, she got an appointment as a postmaster in a small town. And she was, the first postmaster in our family. We have a lot of postal workers in our family, a lot of federal workers. Mm-hmm. And so that was a very proud time for her and, for all of us. And, but it was not without a lot of struggle and a lot of hard work. And there's one thing about my mom. She will out-hustle anyone.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Were they your parents born in Texas?
So my mom was born in San Antonio, and actually her family had lived there for several generations. And I'm not quite sure how many generations back, but as far as I know, they've always lived in that general area. And my dad's family is actually from Western Pennsylvania. He's from a small town called Beaver Falls. Yeah, and just moved to San Antonio through the Air Force.
So, what memories do you have of your parents when you were growing up? You just mentioned a couple things about your mom.
Yeah.
I assume because of the type of job your dad had, he was maybe away a lot, and I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, you know, I feel like the generation of kids that I grew up in was kind of a transitional generation, in that you still had a lot of families where one, you know, were with the mom staying at home. But you started seeing more and more mothers, you know, going into the workforce, you know, with full-time jobs or part-time jobs. Our family was definitely on, you know, the edge of both parents were working full-time and had demanding jobs. So as a result, you know, we were going to after-school care, you know, and, you know, I think I remember only a handful of other kids doing that. You know, and it was, I mean, it was all right. We liked the other kids that we were in after school care with. We liked the teachers, you know, and the care providers. But, I mean, I remember growing up, my mom having a lot longer hours than my dad, but then my dad traveling, whereas my mom did not, you know, for work. And that was, I think that was challenging more so for them than us, you know, as kids. I mean, we had our activities, we had our homework, we were going to sports, we were doing other things with our friends. I think it was probably a lot more challenging for them not to be around us.
So you have, I assume, a mixed family, right? Your dad being from Pennsylvania and your mom from Texas. What traditions has your mom or dad tried to keep alive, you know, from their own heritages?
Yeah, I would say so much, especially from my mom. So my dad isn't as close to his family as my mom is. And so I think that as a result, you know, he's pretty much adopted as many traditions as she, you know, was willing to, you know, introduce into our family as possible. So, I mean, we usually have like tamales with, you know, with the Easter ham, or, you know, so we, especially with the food, we have a lot of, you know, you know, Tex-Mex, you know, cuisine incorporated into our holidays. You know, one thing though we did not necessarily have, and I think probably because, you know, my dad is white and my mom, you know, is Mexican American, is, you know, we didn't have the language as strongly growing up. You know, it was one of those things that we did here. And I mean, you know, I'm fairly versed, but it's one of those things that I did not grow up, you know, on a daily basis speaking Spanish at home. You know, and
Not even in Texas?
Now in Texas, that's different. So in Ohio, absolutely, you know, not. My dad, he wasn't fluent in Spanish. I mean, he could speak just enough to get by. But in Texas, in San Antonio, when we would go in the summers, you know, everyone spoke Spanish. You had to at least be able to navigate that if, you know, you wanted to get by or, you know, do anything. So, but it was typically, you know, grandma and aunts and everyone else speaking in Spanish, and then everyone, you know, the cousins and me and my siblings all answering in English. But, you know, it was, I would say, as far as other traditions and things like that were incorporated into our lives, you know, I feel lucky that we had that. And then, you know, I also have to think about my dad, you know, in that one thing he did do, and it's so funny because we've done this with like my family in San Antonio, is, you know, having like the German food on New Year's. You know, like the pork and sauerkraut and stuffed bell peppers and, you know, stuff like that. So, I mean, you know, he tried to get some in there a little bit.
Great. So once you moved to Ohio, Spanish was definitely not as used or heard or spoken regularly. What about your mom? Did your mom speak Spanish, and does she still try to somehow use it or speak it here in Ohio?
Oh, absolutely. So, she would use Spanish with us, you know, I would say on occasion. It wasn't necessarily like we were having daily conversations in Spanish, but, she would use certain things like, like, you know, sit down and get your homework done, stuff like that. Let's see. But I think that as demographics changed, especially in the Dayton area, and she was able to make more friends who were Hispanic, the Latino community was growing. I think she was able to use Spanish a little bit more. The school district that I lived in, it was 99% white. I would say the only time we were ever using Spanish was in Spanish class. And even that was kind of marginal, so it just wasn't there in the 80s. And they didn't have cultural festivals like they do today or anything of the sort. So there really was a void in terms of that cultural outlet, and those opportunities to celebrate, who we are and, all the richness of the culture.
So for you, having an opportunity to do that was in the summers when you went back to
Absolutely.
Texas and being with family. So still talking about the language, how was your experience with Spanish as you grew, older, maybe in your high school years or maybe even into adulthood when you came to college?
Right. So I think that, that's probably more of a difficult topic for me just because, being, mixed, growing up, my last name is Lynch. And, but I look the way that I look. And so people are oftentimes confused by what's going on here. And, having to go through the story. And I think that the difficult part of it is, when I'm with my family in San Antonio, like my other cousins, the topic is always like, well, you're not really Mexican. Well, no, I am. No, you're not. Your dad's white. Those kind of tensions. And then, you're in Ohio, and they're like, well, you're not really white. You're Mexican. So it's like this tension of not truly being accepted in either world. And, just trying to navigate that and think, well, I am who I am, regardless of how someone else defines me or, might view me. I think that that's probably been more difficult than the language issue. And then, of course, going to college, it's like a whole new world, right? You have people coming from so many different backgrounds and circumstances. And a lot of that kind of falls away. Though I would still get a lot of the questions about the last name. It's quickly, they're like, oh, okay. It's not as big of, I don't think it was as big of a deal as when I was growing up, especially just the stark contrast of the two communities that I was, primarily in, right? But at the same time, that falls away. It's more of a language issue then. Who speaks Spanish and who does not? Who speaks Spanish natively and who does not? And I think that was probably more of, in my college years, more of a challenge, because, you had groups that, specifically just wanted to speak Spanish. And it was like, no, we're not going to do, English over here. And, which is fine too, because everyone needs to do what, they're comfortable with and, find their own way of expression and growth and stuff like that. But, Ohio State's a big place. You get to find you get to find where that is for you. And also the other thing with Ohio State was it has such a diverse Latino community. There's plenty of areas where people can find, their spots, that they can grow. And I think that's what I spent a lot of time doing here. Just trying to find where that was and, really exploring my own identity, and really growing appreciation for other people's, identities, because that's something that I was not exposed to, the diversity within the Latino community.
So did you feel like Ohio State was a place where you could more easily sort of face that or understand how to navigate that, being of mixed heritage,
Absolutely.
the language, etc.?
And I feel like I tackled it with gusto. I think that I was probably one of those students that were just overly involved in everything. So immediately I pledged the co-ed Latino fraternity here on campus, Alpha Psi Lambda. And, one reason was, first off, with a big campus, you're always told you got to make your community small, right? You got to find a small community for you to be involved with because it can be overwhelming. And so I decided that would be a route that I wanted to go in. And it was probably one of the best decisions I made because I automatically was able to grow a peer group. And we were coming from all different backgrounds. It was amazing. And, it automatically gave me a social outlet, but then also it also, I think, kind of sowed the seeds of, service to our community. And so from there, I became involved. And I'm going to talk a lot about my social activities because, at that point in time, education was secondary for me. But I feel like this is where I really had a chance to grow. So I got involved with Que Pasa magazine. And I was involved with that for several years, made some great friends who were the editors of the magazine and also on the editorial board with me. At one point, I was a chair of the editorial board, which I was really excited about. But I thought that was a wonderful outlet for, sharing our stories and our experiences and getting to know, who individuals were in the Latino community here at OSU. And I was also involved with University-wide Council for, Hispanic organizations. Yes, okay, I got that right. And, just all the different Latino student groups, we would come together and, we would joint plan activities or initiatives. I thought that was great too because you had your engineers, you had your business students, you had the Puerto Rican Student Association, it was really a very diverse group even within our community. And then I got to serve on, really cool things that, even now today, I'm still kind of amazed, that we were able to accomplish what we did. But I was on the work group for the Latino Studies organization, or the Latino Studies work group. They were trying to build one here at Ohio State. And I was the undergraduate on the committee. And we had professors from education and the Spanish department and comparative studies. And we spent probably about 2 years, trying to think through, okay, what if it were a program? What if it were a minor? What are the requirements? What do students have to be able to do? And just seeing what that looked like from the student perspective, it was just fascinating. And so my second year in graduate school, I was actually able to take a Latino studies class, that we had been talking about and planning for the past 4 years before. So it was really exciting. And then I was appointed by the vice provost to serve on the university-wide, what was it? Hispanic Oversight Committee. And it was like an organization of professors and, directors in the different colleges, who would talk about more holistically the university community and Latinos. So, all of those experiences, though, I think were probably more valuable to me in my education, and that it taught me the true nature of service and giving of yourself, and trying to be present and thoughtful, about your actions. And of course, with, what I was doing in the classroom, that was also important as well. But some of these other lessons, I felt like, it's really difficult to learn those unless you experience them.
Right. And what degrees do you have here from Ohio State?
Too many, no. For my undergraduate, international studies and political science. And then I went straight into the School of Public Policy and Management, which is now the Glenn College of Public Affairs. And then I took several years off, about 9 years off from school, and I worked full time. And then I decided that I really wanted to get my doctorate. And so I have my Ph.D. in education administration.
Were you as active with school organizations when you were doing your PhD work as you were before, or were you more focused on getting that done?
Yeah, so
I'm sure you had family by then.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I started the program in 2009, and at that point I was a section chief for the education group in the state's Office of Budget Management, and my husband and I had 2 small children. So it was already crazy that I wanted to go back and get a doctorate. On top of that, when you're getting your PhD in the College of Ed, the first 12 months they call it your kind of residency. And you have to have 3 consecutive quarters, this is when we're back on quarters, of full-time enrollment. And so I was taking full-time classes while working full-time and being a mom and a wife. So there was really no opportunity for me to be involved. At least that is not where I wanted to spend my time. Yeah.
Right. What you said you were working for about 9 years before you came back for your degree. What types of jobs have you had here?
Okay. So I think that my professional path has been, I've actually, I don't think I could have planned it any better. I've been very lucky and thankful with all the experiences that I've had. So when I was in graduate school, probably my last quarter in graduate school, I was taking some elective classes in the College of Education, in education, like policy and leadership. And I had a great professor, his name was Brad Mitchell. And I had another great professor who was an adjunct, and his name was Mark Real. And between those 2 classes, you know, I didn't realize what an impact those individuals would have in my life. So I'm really glad that I tried really hard in both of those and did a good job. But Mark ended up offering me a job with the Children's Defense Fund before I left, before I graduated, before that class was over. And, you know, at first I thought, well, I'm not sure if this is the right thing for me. I like education, but I don't know if nonprofit's where I want to go. And my dad actually told me at one point, he was like, you've got to do this. There's no other time in your life you're going to be able to do this. Because he knew how much they were offering me. It wasn't that much, but it was, you know, it was one of those things where sometimes the experiences that you have are worth so much more, you know, than the salary they can pay. And this was one of those experiences. So I worked for Children's Defense Fund as a research fellow for about 1.5 years. And then I moved over to another organization that Mark had started called Kids Ohio. And I was his first policy analyst, or, you know, education policy lead. And that was really exciting. It was kind of a step up for me, in that I got to set the agenda for our education portfolio. And I was with Kids Ohio for about 1.5 years. And it was during that time where I met someone else who would make a big difference in my life. And his name's Jack Jackson. And he was working for a public relations firm that we were doing some work with. And I remember having a conversation with him, you know, about what I wanted to do. And I wanted to continue in my work in like education policy. And he was like, well, Tracy, if you want to do something with education policy, you need to get some state experience. And he was like, apply for a job at the state's Office of Budget Management. Apparently he had been with OBM for several years, and he was a section chief there, and he did extremely well. So he knew what he was talking about. And so I struggled with that, you know, advice, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to leave this now because I really like working nonprofits. But sometimes you have to do that. So I applied for a job, and I went to work for the state's Office of Budget and Education in their education group, or Office of Budget Management in their education group. And Then I met someone else who was very influential in my professional career. The person who hired me there, his name was Tim Keene, and he's actually the current state budget director. And he, at that point, he was like, I think the assistant. And he, I mean, he was just a great person, you know, super smart. And, you know, he had a lot of, I think that there was a lot of things that he had to navigate in his own job that many of the people, the analysts that were working there, you know, we got to witness and observe and learn from. But even more importantly was the woman that I worked for. And she's just amazing. She's actually still one of my best friends. Her name is Rebecca Vasquez Gillings. So she's Puerto Rican. She's from the Cleveland area. But she was like my first like female boss. And, you know, it was kind of funny because I had been working like professionally for about, you know, 4 years at that point, more or less. And I had never worked for a woman before. And it was amazing. I loved it. She was like encouraging, she was empowering. You know, she was very firm and she was very, let's see, confident in her leadership. So she was a great role model for me to, you know, learn from. But I was with OBM for about 7 years. And actually, Rebecca encouraged me to apply for a section chief position there. So she moved positions and I actually took her position. And I don't know if you've ever been through a state budget or anything like that, but it's exciting, it's exhausting, and it's nonstop. And it was like that for about 7 years. And it was around that time where, you know, we had our second child and I decided I needed to, you know, maybe do something different. I'd worked for 3 governors. I had gone through at that point, I think 4 budget cycles. Did a lot of really cool things that I'm still very proud of. I worked in school funding. I worked in higher education, financial aid policy for the state. I mean, there was so many neat projects that I was given the opportunity to do. And around that point, you know, someone from my past reemerges into my life. And I had just happened to go to like a documentary screening of, because that's what I do, and it was on education. And I ran into one of my old professors, Brad Mitchell. And, you know, I kind of stayed behind after the screening, you know, to say hello. And he kind of looked at me and was like, hey, are you happy doing what you're doing right now? Are you ready to do something different? And I mean, it was like he read my mind. And I was like, yeah, I think I am. How did you know? And so I'd say within like 4 or 5 weeks, you know, they had offered me a position with Battelle for Kids as a senior director for an initiative that they were kicking off in southeastern Ohio in the Appalachian region of the state. The state of Ohio had received a $54 million teacher incentive fund grant, and they needed someone to help lead it. And this is not something I had ever done before, but at the same time it was reassuring that, you know, people that I respected also had faith in me to do this. And so I went to work for them and managed this huge federal grant with all these rural superintendents who are doing God's work every single day. I don't know how they do it. And, you know, these amazing teachers and teacher leaders. And it was super humbling in so many ways. And that experience, I think, was probably the hardest thing I did, just because it was so close to the ground. Everything I'd done had been policy. It was way up here, you know, 10,000 foot level. And this is actual activities and efforts that are touching human beings. And you're seeing it on a day-to-day basis. And I just loved it. I loved it. So that project was a 6-year project. Well, originally 5. We had a 1-year extension on it. I had the privilege of working with around, it was around 3,000 teachers when you combine the student populations of the school district we worked with, they would have been the largest school district in the state of Ohio. And some of these districts were so small. They had like graduating classes of like 20 or 30, where others were, I mean, within the same region, right? Same Appalachian region, with other high schools just huge, you know. But the goal was to increase college readiness for these students, making sure that they had, you know, that their teachers had the professional development and structures in place to be more effective in the classroom, as, you know, they aspired to be in the classroom with these resources. And the talent within some of these buildings is just astounding. I mean, what they're able to do when they have children coming into their buildings at kindergarten unable to identify letters in some cases, or never having a preschool experience, and how they're able to grow them over time it's very inspiring. So that experience in of itself, I mean, it really, I probably feel like I grew the most from that, just because I was stretched in so many different ways that I wasn't sure I could do. But you know, you give it your best try every time. And yeah, it was, I'm very proud of that. But then from Battelle for Kids, I moved over to a management consulting firm called Education First. And they're a national group that does consulting on education, policy, implementation, ideation with school districts, foundations, states. And that was, I would say that was probably a really challenging experience, just because it's management consulting, and I'm used to doing very much place-based work, in that I'm working in this region, you know, I'm working on, in you know, having those relationships, where this was, you know, management consulting, you're going from client to client across the country. And so an opportunity to really learn and grow from that. The other thing is, it's probably one of the largest collections of absolutely brilliant people that I've ever met in my life. So the woman that hired me, her name is Susan Bodery, and she was the education advisor for Governor Taft, and I had met her when I was working with the Office of Budget Management. And so much respect for this woman. She is just amazing. And again, another opportunity to work for a very strong woman. I was just like, you know, chomping at the bit. And I'm just, you know, thankful that, you know, I had that opportunity, you know, to really, well, we did a lot of work together in Michigan for a little while, and having long drives up there, you know, conversations about leadership and about work and ideas and family and balancing it all. It was very valuable to me personally. However, I would say about 9 months into my role there, an opportunity presented itself to go back to Children's Defense Fund of Ohio. And I mean, it was one of those things where I knew in my heart it was what I wanted, but at the same time, I just had that nagging feeling that I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's too big of a role. You know, I still have young children. They weren't that young, but still, you know, you put all these excuses in front of yourself. And, you know, I really struggled with the decision even to pursue it for several months. And, you know, but finally my husband, Israel, he said, you know, you should just try it. You should just do this. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I would be successful. And he kind of looked at me and he was like, really? He's like, I'm pretty sure you've been preparing for this your entire career. And did you know that you were ready? Did we know we were ready to have kids? Did we know we were ready for, you know, taking these big professional leaps? No, you do it, you know, and you just have faith in yourself and you do your best. And he also reminded me that I would be really, really upset with whoever they hired, because I would always feel that that should be mine, which he was right. So Yeah, so I threw my hat in, and thankfully, when I interviewed for it in DC with the leadership team with Children's Defense Fund, they perhaps saw something in me immediately that I did not, and they extended an offer, and I accepted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I feel like my career at this point has kind of come full circle, right. And that's where I started, and that's where I want to be now. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Great. So throughout all of this work and professional experiences that you've had, you've also got married and had children.
Oh, yeah,
so I want to go back to that and have you talk a little bit about that. Is your husband Latino, and your kids are thinking back to about some of your own growing up and how you're choosing to keep some of the traditions within your family? If you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And, it's funny, as you're asking me that question, I have this tendency to kind of separate my life. I have my professional life, and then I have my personal life. And I feel sometimes that these two shall never cross. So I try to keep them very compartmentalized, which is, I think, maybe an odd thing for people, but that's just how I keep myself, I guess, sane. Because, you want to be able to be present and give all to each. Especially on the family side. So I met my husband actually here at Ohio State, and I'm very happy to say that the first time I saw him, I knew I was going to marry him. And it was actually at an informational meeting for Alpha Psi Lambda, and I was, sitting with some of the other prospective members, and just getting to know them. This is the first time that we had all met each other. And I just remember this young man walking into the room, and he had this baseball cap on that said Mexico on it. And I remember just looking at him like, wow. And I leaned over to my friend Veronica, and she wasn't my friend at the time, I had just met her. I leaned over to her, I'm like, oh yeah, I am so gonna marry him. And we're laughing, we're giggling. And it's kind of amazing that we ended up together, and we got engaged my senior year, and we were married after my first year in graduate school, and my mom planned our wedding in San Antonio. Wow. So he's Mexican American, he's from Brownsville, and he ended up in Ohio because his dad was getting his doctorate at Ohio State. And so they lived in Worthington, and his parents decided to stay until he graduated. So he could, because they had already moved him once in middle school. They didn't want to do it again in high school. So as soon as he graduated from high school, got into Ohio State, and they moved him into his dorm, they moved to Texas and left him here. No, they didn't leave him here, but they moved to Austin. So, I think we had very similar experiences growing up in that where he lived in Worthington, he was one of maybe a handful of Latinos there. Mm-hmm. Actually, he said maybe one of two, and the other one was Nicaraguan, and he was very, he looked white. Mm. So everyone thought that my husband was Indian for the longest time. But, so we had just very, very similar experiences. Let's see. So yes, we got married in 1999 in San Antonio, and it was a big Mexican wedding. Mm. So it was the first wedding in both our families, so it had to be big, right? Very, very big, very traditional. We had mariachis, the whole thing. I think I had like 10 bridesmaids because, had to have everyone. Of course, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Primas and primos.
Yes, everyone. And let's see, we have 2 children. Our oldest is Israel the 4th. We call him Riley. And he's 15 years old. He'll be 16 November. And then our youngest is Tatiana. She's 12. Oh, no, she's 13. Sorry, she turned 13 2 months ago. And let's see, and I would say that, what I always aspired for our children, right? Even before we had children, was for them to have a sense of who they were and pride in who they were. And even though we had decided, that we wanted to, grow roots here in Ohio, we wanted to make sure that they had those experiences of being surrounded by family and also being exposed to the culture as much as possible. So I would say even from the time Riley was born, we were already planning on annual trips or even, twice-a-year trips to Texas, to San Antonio, to Austin, to Brownsville, so that they can meet, be with their aunts and uncles and their grandparents and, everyone else. And we've been doing that since they were born. So we go at least once or twice a year. I would say that they are more so removed, though, than I was, in that they didn't have that first 6 years of, growing up in, Texas or wherever, being surrounded by it, total immersion. I would say it's probably, they probably don't feel as conflicted as I do or as I did, in that, I don't even know how to explain this. They're growing up with kids that they've known since they were 3. Right. Who, they're not getting asked about, what's up with your last name? Mm-hmm. Though their last name is Nahida. So the questions that they are getting is, how do you pronounce it? Mm-hmm. Which it makes me want to cry when I hear that. I'm like, good. They want to pronounce it correctly. Mm-hmm. That's good. Mm-hmm. Now, I would say that my daughter probably has more of an affinity and a connection to the culture than my son does. His connections are to like technology and Xbox and, sports and stuff like that. But again, that's also, I think, a way of connecting with other, his peers as well, regardless of their background. In terms of Spanish, I see that my daughter has more of an affinity for the language than my son does. He sees it more as a subject or a task or something that he needs to pass. But I hold out hope that he's going to change in his perceptions of that.
Maybe college will do that to him.
I hope so. Maybe, yeah.
Right.
But, they both have grown up with, obviously the food and the music and being surrounded by, their aunts and uncles. But, I think that there probably are missing a little bit of something like, going to, fiesta in San Antonio, or, learning to dance cumbia. But I think that, in their generation, they'll have other challenges and opportunities, especially as it comes to how they want to navigate being a Latino here in Ohio.
Mm-hmm. What has been one of the most difficult times of living here? And it could be, just those early years of moving here when you were a child and trying to adapt to a new place, or maybe in your life here as a professional.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, and I think that this might be true for others as well, but, I think being exposed to bigotry and racism at such an early age was probably the most difficult thing for me. Because, when you're young, you don't really think about the world in those terms. And then when you experience it, it's like a blow, it's a kick to the gut. You're like, oh my gosh, how could anyone ever see me as, as anything else, than what I am, and having less value as a person than what I do. I would say that's probably the most difficult. And it comes out in, very, blatant ways sometimes, and then in others, just, it's very much undercover, but you sense it's there. And I didn't realize it till later, but, one of the ways, and I think I realized it like when I was maybe about 10 or 11, what was going on, but at the time I didn't. When I first enrolled in schools in Tip City, my sister was put in a special education class, and I was put in like the lowest first grade class with children that weren't quite reading. And, automatically I didn't think anything of it other than, well, they just got this wrong. And so I told my mom, I was like, take me to the library, I need to check out some books. And she was like, okay, because we all read a lot. And so I think I checked out like 15 books, whatever the maximum was, they were letting 6-year-olds take out. And I took all my books to school, and I sat in front of the teacher's desk, just started reading each book. And she was like, are you trying to tell me something? And I was like, yes, I'm in the wrong class. But I didn't say it. I had to show and prove, that I was in the wrong class. I didn't necessarily want to embarrass the other kids. And so I think about it now, I'm like, why did I do this? And, but yeah, they switched me immediately to another classroom. And I always thought, well, they just got it wrong. But then I kind of started understanding later on, no, they didn't get it wrong. Yes, they did get it wrong, but this was intentional. They're assuming because, you're assuming because, maybe you're coming from a different state, you're brown, maybe, they're assuming that you have an accent, that perhaps you can't read, or you're not as prepared for first grade as the other kids. Yeah, absolute false assumptions. So, but I feel worse for my sister though, because, she was put in a special education classroom. She was extremely bright, and I'm not quite sure what was going on there. I probably still have to talk to my parents about that and see how that was resolved. But, my dad, he was a huge advocate for us. And if I know my dad, he probably went and raised hell about something and got her moved immediately. But I mean, I think having him to advocate for us was really important. But, at the same time, it was unfortunate, that's the step it had to go. And I would say that was probably the most difficult for not only me, but for my siblings.
And the work that you do with children and your experiences in the education field,
yes.
Do you feel that that's still happening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, one of the things that we have today that we didn't necessarily have like 30 years ago, 35 years ago when I was in school, is access to really good data. And data is very powerful because it tells the truth. This is the situation that we're living in. And so at Children's Defense Fund, we advocate for children who are most vulnerable in our society. Children of color, children who are poor, who have no lobbyists for them, who don't vote. And one of the things that we really focus on is, racial, ethnic disparities in education, healthcare, juvenile justice, which is a huge issue for us right now. And the way that we're able to do that is looking at this disaggregated data and looking at the disparities among the different races and thinking about, why is it this way? What are the root causes that are leading to this? Because a system was designed to have this result. How do we dismantle that? And there's very stark, examples of that. One of them being like, infant mortality. Though black babies are dying at, 5 times the rate as white babies here in Ohio, Latino babies are also, dying before their first birthday at a higher rate as well, though not as extreme, as, African American babies. But again, we have to look at that data and really dig in and understand, what is it that's happening in our society that's leading to this result? Is it transportation? Is it housing? Is it toxic stress? Is it, is it the economy? There's all these different things that are feeding into that. So with the example that I shared from when I was in school, it would have been great, if there was, an organization that was advocating for children, and I'm sure there were, but maybe they didn't have access to this data, that was showing where children were being placed. you know, whether it be special education, whether it be for disciplinary referrals, you know, any of those things, because what you would see is a very stark contrast between children of color and their treatment and white children. And then you have to think about, okay, what does the system look like that's, you know, creating these results? You know, when you have like a 90%, you know, teaching force that is white, and maybe they aren't as culturally competent as they should be to, you know, really approach the children and work with children that are of all backgrounds. So, I mean, in essence, I mean, that's the, you know, core of the work that we do. Right. It's research, it's policy, and it's advocacy. So making sure that all children have the opportunity to, you know, to thrive into adulthood.
So I asked you about one of the most difficult experiences. Now tell me about one of your proudest moments or more successful times in your life that you can think of. And again, it could be professional, it could be personal, it could be...
I think that I'd probably just divide it into the two, you know, because I compartmentalize everything. But I would say, personally, you know, I'm proud of my family. You know, I'm proud of my husband and my children. You know, they're just like, you know, such points of inspiration for me. I love being a mother and a wife. I just relish the time that I have with them. And, you know, all their successes, all their challenges, I just feel it so deeply. And I'm proud of the individuals that they're becoming, you know, me included, because they're changing me too every day. So personally, you know, that they are my source of pride, and they always will be. And I think about, you know, my son and daughter and just how different they are. So my son is very artistic. He wants to be the next Stanley. And he has wanted to do this since he was like 2 or 3 years old, since he could hold like a pencil. And he lights from within, you know, when he's creating, when he's painting, when he's drawing, when he's cartooning. And, you know, it's amazing to see that, you know, and it fills me with joy just to see that he can be happy, you know, with that. And, you know, he's also a cross-country runner, and, you know, he does all that. And I'm very proud of the individual that he's becoming, and, you know, of the friends that he has, because they're all very good people. And I always, you know, I'm sure others have heard their parents say, you know, show me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. And I'm super encouraged by, you know, how discerning he is of people, and, you know, being a good chooser of friends. So that's been wonderful. And my daughter, she's just such an individual. She's feisty. She wants to change the world. She will go, she's already gone to like 2 different protests. She led a walkout at her elementary school, but she is a rule follower, so she had to plan it with the principal. And she had a contingency plan in case it was too cold for the kids. But I just have to laugh, and I'm just like smiling ear to ear whenever, you know, she's telling me about the latest thing that she's very passionate about and what she's going to do about it. So I really, I'm very, very proud of the, you know, person that she's becoming, despite, you know, any kind of pushback she gets from her peers or her friends about things. You know, she'll listen to them, but she'll be like, nope, this is right. This is what I'm going to do. And that self-assuredness, I think, is, it's going to serve her well when she's, you know, an adult, and as she's becoming an adult. And my husband, he's just been my rock all these years. You know, everything I would say everything crazy and just outlandish that I wanted to do, he would say, okay, are you sure? And then he'd back me 100%. I think that going back and getting my doctorate was not easy. And it was just not a one-person thing. It was the whole family getting involved. So he was the one making dinners, 3 or 4 nights out of the week for the kids, and making sure all the homework was done, and he was a single dad, like I would say 60 or 70% of the time when I was in class, for at least 2 or 3 years there. So everything that, I think his belief in me, I'm so proud of that. And I hope every day that I'm worthy of that.
Right.
So that's my personal life. Professionally, I think professionally, I've always tried to make some type of difference. And I've tried to look at issues, especially education issues, from different perspectives. So the professional theme, I think, and just reflecting on it, has been, I want to do a lot of work and get really on the ground with the policy piece. I want to dig in as much as possible. And that's at the 10,000-foot level. On the advocacy piece, it's getting kind of a little closer to the ground, but you're working with advocates and direct service providers and kind of that bridge between policy and direct service, right? And so I tried to get as much immersed in that as I could, my work in nonprofit fields. And then, with the research and with on the ground realities, working at Battelle for Kids really gave me that grounding. And, you can have the best policy in the world, but if you can't win people's hearts and minds and convince them it's the right thing, they're not going to implement it. It's not going to make a difference to any child, unless you're doing that, strong implementation strategy, convincing people that, yes, this is the right thing to do by children, and this is how we need to do it. So in getting all those different types of experiences, I've tried to marry, those different perspectives in the work that I do now, and having that holistic view of, we can have great ideas and great policy, but let's think through to the ground and what this looks like for kids every day.
You mentioned a little bit ago that sort of you and your husband decided to sort of grow roots here, right, in Ohio. What advice would you give to people, either recent immigrants or just people moving into our community, especially Latino families, about what should they know or what should they do as they navigate moving into a new community, new place?
I think back about when I first came to college. And, I think about this too when, the kids start a new school, or join in. Don't be afraid. Just join in and start creating your community. It's hard because, though I think that I'm probably more of an introvert than an extrovert, but one of the things that you have to learn is just to go out and meet people and talk to people, and not to be afraid to do that. Even if it's just on your child's behalf, you need to do that. And I know, and I've been in lots of situations where I'm the only woman in the room, or I'm the only Latina in the room. But at the same time, you're there for a reason, right? And you need to be able to think about your life in terms of, you define your life and you need to make your path. Otherwise, other people will do that for you, and you don't want that. So how do you do that, my husband and I talk a lot about creating community for our children ever since they were born, and what do we want that community to look like? And it involves, our neighbors, it involves our church, and, it involves those different extracurriculars that we want, either we want our kids to be in or they want to be in, in those group of people. But we want people to know our children. We want to know their children, and we want to know each other, because that's our social fabric, that our community is built on. So if new immigrants, if new residents, Latinos that come to Central Ohio, I would say, start creating that fabric of what do you want your children's community to look like, or what do you want your community to look like, because you can choose that in many ways. In some ways maybe you can't, but I think that there's a lot of ways that you can for the better.
Great. Is there anything else you would like to add to this interview about your experience, your life, growing up in Ohio?
I think that I'm very hopeful, for the future and what Ohio looks like, though we have a lot of challenges here. I think that despite the current politics and the current rhetoric, especially around immigrants and Latinos, I think that we still have a lot of hope and, a very bright future here. I think that, bigotry and racism, they're not a thing of the past, they're a thing of the present. But I also believe that we are a strong enough community, to be resilient enough to not only push past this, but also change hearts and minds about this. This is not the America I think that any of us want or ever dreamt of. And I mean, the civil rights movement, their work is not done. Our work is not done. There's a lot of areas where we still need to push forward. And for anyone to be complacent, I think is, that's just a tragedy. We can't do that. But I think that hopefulness for the future, that positivity for the future, that's what's going to be the driving momentum to keep us pushing forward. I know things are better for my children than they were for me 30 years ago. And my hope is that we continue forward in this, struggle, this effort, this movement to make sure that my grandchildren's lives are better and they have even more opportunities, when they go to school and when they become adults.
Well, Tracy, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you. Thanks.